principled, who have money, and who ran banks honestly.
Certain men in industry.
That's right, and certain men in industry that were honest, etc. But there were other industrials like Carnegie and Ford that got into bed with government and started to use government's monopoly powers to secure them against competition. And that's not true free market capitalism. That is crony capitalism, or mercantilism as it used to be called in history. So what happened to Mao Zedong, of course, he was financed by the West. He was given loans from them which were never paid back and never forced into redemption. He was given arms by George Catlett Marshall, who ran World War II. He was the supreme Allied commander, political commander ahead of Dwight D. Eisenhower. In fact, we could go on for another hour about the horrors that Eisenhower committed in World War II in terms of he literally gave the order to starve 2 million German prisoners of war who had made every human effort to get to the Western Front so that they could capitulate to the Allies rather than go into the Soviet gulags. They had used draconian efforts to yield themselves to the Allies, knowing that they'd be given liberty. And here he put them in open barbed wire encampments during the winter without tents, without sufficient food, and literally gave the death sentence to 2 million German. We could say, well, we may not have sympathy for these people, but soldiers themselves are not guilty for the acts of war. It's the leaders that are really the evil ones.
Okay.
But the British and Eisenhower as well took Russian troops who had never been under Stalin, who had always been free Russian troops, and turned them over to Stalin at the end of the war and tricked them into doing so, telling them they were going to a camp run by the British, and they had loaded into trucks and they drove them into a Soviet camp and turned them over as prisoners.
Okay.
Just some horrible crimes against humanity. We had Operation Keelhaul run by Eisenhower, whereby he took all of the refugees who had fled Stalin's Russia to Germany and to Albania and every place else, and he herded them all back, even at gunpoint. A lot of people committed suicide rather than go back. And Eisenhower was ruthless about obeying Stalin's command because of Roosevelt and because of George Catlett Marshall, of driving these people back. And these are a great black mark against the West that are very not told about. Going back to the Russian Revolution, for example, when we had, after the Kerensky government, which was a puppet government in between the revolutions, this was kind of like a coalition government to have peace between the Bolsheviks and what was called the White Russian opposition. They were betrayed by the West. The White Russians had the superior armies, and then their arms were cut off by the West, and arms were allowed to flow and not interdicted to the Reds. And so it's just like Mao Zedong.
Oh, that's where that drink comes from. White Russian. Well, okay, real quick then. Soviet Union collapse, the era of Gorbachev, and then the creation of Russia. What was really going on there?
In my World Affairs brief, I cover this aspect extensively. That this, in my opinion, was a very carefully crafted deception. It was foretold by Anatoly Golitsyn, one of the primary defectors from Russia. He knew about this 20 years before it happened. He said they're planning another major era of détente where they will pretend like the Soviet Union is collapsing in order to get the West to take on the burden of all of the satellite states economically while they continue to build economically. And what was interesting, anybody who saw, I was present when this was happening. I was watching the news coverage, and I said to myself, I'm not believing what I'm hearing. The parroting going on by the West, they're covering for the Russians. It was so obvious to a trained eye, for even an untrained eye, that this was a fraud. Here you have Gorbachev in his undefended villa, and the KGB failed to arrest him, could not complete the attack on Gorbachev. Who would we believe that this KGB has overthrown governments, runs one of the most sophisticated assassination teams in the world, and it can't take down Gorbachev in his undefended villa? And then Yeltsin stands up on a tank in Red Square and broadcasts to all the world, but the television station is still in control of the communists, and we're to believe that they didn't flip the switch?
The CIA can't find bin Laden, by the way.
That's right.
It's kind of funny how that works.
So you see, this was a fraud, and then we're to believe that in the aftermath of the coup, the head of the KGB, the defense minister, and the head of the GRU, which is the military Soviet intelligence, fled from who? Who else has military and power? Who runs the secret police but those three people? Well, what it means is either they didn't flee, or if they were fleeing, they weren't in charge. In fact, every one of those three individuals, some 2 years before, were mid-level bureaucrats. Now, if you know anything about the Soviet system, same thing with Gorbachev. He was a mid-level arms negotiator 2 years before he ascended to the premiership. Now, that doesn't happen in Soviet communism. Mm-hmm. It's a ruthless system where you cut your way to the top by, assassinating, and there's a lot of infighting, etc. in communism. But when someone takes you from being a mid-level bureaucrat to being premier, that means you aren't running the show, you're a puppet. And when the head of the KGB and the GRU and the defense minister were mid-level bureaucrats and suddenly ascended, somebody brought them up. And those are the people really running behind the scenes. Now, who are they? Well, essentially they are what we call the Russian oligarchs today. All of the Russian oligarchs, or the Russian mafia, that President Putin claims to despise and that they're the enemy of the state, were in fact the Russian leaders.
And Putin was KGB, correct?
That's right. They were the Russian leaders who were the bosses of Putin.
Okay.
Boris Berezovsky, Khodorkovsky, and the rest. Now, let me show you how they did this. What they did, since they controlled things, they told the Soviet Central Bank to loan them the money so that they could buy up Gazprom, the oil and the gold concerns, all of these major industries that made them suddenly wealthy. Where did they get the money to buy this? From the Russian Central Bank. How did they have the power to get the Russian Central Bank to do that? They were the heads of government. This was proven by one of my sources in Russia who said, when Yeltsin was president and Boris Berezovsky was secretary of the Commonwealth of Independent States, the CIS, they were having a meeting in the Kremlin. He saw Yeltsin step aside and usher Gorbachev in first. Now, in Russian protocol, that's never done unless that person is a superior to you. And that indicates that Yeltsin knew who was running the show. Now, Boris Yeltsin is playing the role as the antagonist. He sits in London in his villa. He's very wealthy, and he pretends openly to be attacking Putin. He claimed to be able to mount a coup against Gorbachev, and he was going to do it with all of his millions of dollars. Now, who in their right mind, if they're going to do a coup against a government, would advertise it to the whole world? This is a fraud. Mm-hmm. This is a charade. In fact, Boris Berezovsky met with Vladimir Putin 5 times at his Spanish villa the year Putin ascended to the presidency. Now, that doesn't sound like enemies to me. But Putin is playing the role that he's an enemy, and it's because by setting himself up as the president who's against the oligarchs, he at once poisons capitalism in the minds of people, because the oligarchs, which are actually communists, claiming to be capitalists. So it poisons the people against that. Mm-hmm. Our attacks in the Balkans and Serbia also poisoned the people in Russia against America. But Putin and his puppet Medvedev is able to project himself as if he is the enemy of the oligarchs. This causes the Russians, who are longing for the good old days when we were the powerful world nation, to look to Putin as the great nationalist savior of Russia. All of this is carefully planned deception, perhaps the greatest deception that has been foisted upon the world, the phony fall of the Soviet Union.
There's a couple different red flags that I began to see about 3 to 2 years ago that lead me to wonder if a possible upcoming World War III is on the horizon, and that it's staged by a certain number of people. Here's a couple of red flags. There's a lot of unanswered questions to 9/11, for one thing, which is a completely separate topic. However, we have not seen those questions publicly being raised by China and Russia, yet they've criticized American foreign policy. But if they really want to be critical, let's take a closer look at what's really going on. You have some other things, too. I'm just leading here to something for those also in the audience that might be wondering the same thing. We look at the situation last year with Georgia. We see the United States funding Georgia and Israel as well, billions of dollars to commit literally genocide in South Ossetia. So we're seeing these type of posturings and things like this, movements taking place out in the Baltic Sea and other things Then I looked a little further, then I found many reports of Putin and Bush vacationing together, and pictures of them vacation together, and reports of Putin going to Crawford. So it raises another question. The other thing is China. If China's so critical of the things that we're doing, why are they funding our war in the Middle East? And in terms of the issues with 9/11, those particular towers, those have been shipped to China at a very affordable rate. There are many people who would like to get their hands on those pieces of steel to take a look at the forensic evidence to figure out why they ended up coming down the way that they did. But for some reason, it's in China. So I want to get your take on why, when we have terror drills here in Portland, for example, they say it's about an al-Qaeda dirty bomb attack, but they're really doing drills in aerospace. They're simulating an attack from another country. Right now, some people listening may be hearing the jets overhead, and there's a lot of activity up there because they're doing drills and Navy war games off the ocean, anticipating a day where something is going to be happening here, in particular the Pacific Northwest, Seattle. Where would you like to begin in terms of...
Well, you've covered a lot of ground, Alex.
Yeah, wherever you'd like to begin, but I just want to get all that out there. These are just some of the red flags that are out there.
Well, how to begin? It's important to understand about the war on terror that, in my estimation, this is fraudulent. That isn't to say that there aren't legitimate terrorists. In fact, our actions in the Middle East have done more to provoke additional hatred and discontent against America than almost anything we can do. We have built a large body of terrorists if they didn't exist before. But the question is, who controls the controllers of terrorism? I'll give you an example. If we had legitimate independent terrorism that wasn't being controlled, we have essentially open borders in the southwest with Mexico through at least half the border, in our oceans as well, very little security. You can drive a rowboat or drive a motorboat right up to the beach and there isn't any Coast Guard to stop you. Terrorists can do the same thing. If there were as much independent terrorism as our government claims, we would be inundated with normal acts of terrorism, blowing up electrical pylons out in the desert southwest. They're totally unprotected, blowing up railroad lines, walking into malls as suicide bombers. These should be happening every month.
During Katrina, nothing happened either. That was a time when our nation was vulnerable.
How difficult is it for a terrorist to get into Mexico? Nothing at all. How difficult is it to walk across the border with a coyote leading the way? Not difficult. There's been nothing. Not a single act of normal terrorism before 9/11 or after 9/11. Why only these major, high-profile, sophisticated events that, in fact, frankly, could not have been done without black operations specialists from our own government assisting? You can't bring down those towers with those airplanes the way that they did, because of the structural core of the center of the towers could have held up the towers alone. And the airplane that hit the second tower only clipped the side of the building, didn't touch that core. And yet it came down.
Concrete was pulverized, molten steel was found.
And the reason that steel was shipped away is so that the evidence of planned demolition could, of course, Building 7 was an obvious planned demolition. In fact, there were several witnesses to the demolition. There were announcements to the firefighters to get out because we're going to bring the building down. And so Building 7 in the World Trade Center we know is a planned demolition. That means that there are tens of demolition experts who know they planted the explosives in these buildings and yet have not come forth. And obviously there are some very powerful threats against them were they to do so. But the entire 9/11 was created as a scenario in order to justify going into Afghanistan and Iran. And there was an argument in the White House whether or not to go into Iraq or Afghanistan. And one side said, no, we've got to go into Afghanistan first. At first, meaning that we're going to use this to justify going into Iraq. So the reasons for attacking both Afghanistan and Iraq were fraudulent. And they will continue to do so, but we're definitely building a huge base, 14 minor bases and 4 major bases. We do not intend to leave. Obama claiming that he's going to pull these troops out is not true. He's simply going to change the names and the designation of the troops. There'll be at least 50,000 troops staying. And I believe that there's going to be a major regional war starting with an attack on Iran by Israel, which will be followed by a counterattack against American forces, which will justify the U.S. getting involved in this major regional war in Iran.